Hi there, I'm Ryan Kilmer, and on behalf of my colleagues Mariah Kornbluh, Sue Limber, Maury Nation, and Rachel Siegal, I welcome you to the session on Safe and Humane Schools, sponsored by the Safe and Humane Schools Task Force of the Global Alliance for Behavioral Health and Social Justice. As a disclosure at the start, we, the presenters, have no actual or potential conflict of interest in relation to this presentation. As a bit of an introduction before we talk about what to expect in this session, we felt like it's really critical as an organization that we have a task force focusing on our schools because they reflect such a central ecological setting for our kids and youth. They're critical settings in our communities, provide tremendous stability, and they're a prime setting for interventions. This then relates to our task force's overarching objective: to address practices and policies that impact the behavioral health and well-being of students, as well as multiple issues of social justice. The Alliance previously had a Safe and Humane Schools task force. Actually, it was active when we were the American Orthopsychiatric Association. It was active previously, and we've chosen to reinstate it this year because we saw needs as so pronounced. Prior activities included such things as a resolution on violence prevention in the schools. And Sue Limber was on that prior committee. In progress, our own group has a policy resolution in the works regarding the impact of active shooter trainings and really the need for us to utilize applied research and evaluation to inform best practices on this front, to really have more of an evidence base to inform the nature of those trainings. And Mariah Kornbluh is taking the lead on that. Our goals for this session, they've shifted somewhat in the context of a virtual conference. We'd originally certainly framed the need to discuss priorities and issues upon which we wanted to focus, to identify some key needs and recommendations as a task force, and to think of this as a way to help recruit or engage new members and convey opportunities. While we don't have the same possibilities for interaction as we would in a live roundtable, we're still hoping through this recorded session to convey those priorities, areas of focus, and ways that you can get involved. So our plan for today, here's a bit of a roadmap. Sue Limber will start us off talking about schools as communities and the limitations in our schools. Maury Nation will then follow up by talking about ethnic and racial disparities, substantial issues in our schools, and the degree to which structural and systemic factors come into play. Mariah Kornbluh will talk about school choice and its implications, and Rachel Siegal will bring us home, talking about considering equity and how we should utilize equity in our thought processes regarding and decision-making regarding programming and policies. Then we'll talk about some ways in which you can get involved. So with that, I pass the screen to Sue Limber.
Great, thanks so much, Ryan. I think if you would advance the slide, Ryan. Thank you so much. Before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge some very important people. I think as most of you know, Gary Melton, who is actually my graduate school advisor, my former boss, longtime close friend and colleague, passed away unexpectedly earlier this week. He not only founded this group's work on safe and humane schools, but he set the stage and inspired my work in this field. And pertinent to my talk today, invited me and my co-authors and former students, Holly Grover and Liepa Boberini, to write a review on U.S. schools as places of community, which I anticipate is going to be published in the near future. So it's this review I'll be pulling from today, and I also wanted to, in addition to Gary, acknowledge Holly and Liepa for their great work on this review of an extensive literature. Go to the next slide, please. Although I think the word community often elicits thoughts of geographic area, it obviously also denotes relationships among people. Family is undoubtedly the first community to which most children belong, but as they age, other communities become increasingly important to children's well-being. Here in the United States, once children reach school age, they spend more time at school, or at least they did pre-COVID, than anywhere outside of the home. And as a result, there's been a great deal of interest in trying to understand the nature of the relationships among students and families and school staff, and the importance of those relationships for children's well-being. Researchers have used different terms and different constructs to describe these relationships, but we, Holly, Leah, and I believe that school community, I think, captures the essence of these relationships and constructs, because members of a community feel they belong, that they matter to each other, and that their needs will be met through their interactions. Here you can see Libby highlighted 9 constructs that she felt were particularly relevant to these relationships. If you could go to the next slide. Research, I think, shows us that in order to create an environment that cultivates a sense of community, a school must be, at a minimum, be perceived as safe and fair, encourage active participation by students, foster positive relationships with peers and staff and family members, and ultimately be a place where students want to be or feel where they belong. Next slide. So when schools are places of community, students benefit in numerous ways. I'm going to highlight just a few of these where there's been some of the most research. So let's look at better educational outcomes. Academically, we know that students who feel a sense of community at school have higher standardized test scores, better grades, lower dropout rates. And some of the mechanisms that appear to be functioning here are greater student motivation, higher self-efficacy, more class participation, greater trust. The effectiveness of positive school community on reducing problem behavior and promoting positive behaviors has also been well documented, both through longitudinal as well as intervention studies. We know that positive school community is associated with lower rates of substance abuse, less violence, fewer conduct problems, less bullying, for example. And feelings of school community have a profound influence, obviously, on mental, social, and emotional well-being. Outcomes include, for example, greater life satisfaction, optimism, acceptance of outgroups, less depression, anxiety, and less suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Go to the next slide. So in the eyes of US students, do schools today embody strong communities by promoting safety, fairness, active participation, positive relationships, and this sense of belonging? I think the answer is mixed. So let me give just a few snapshots, beginning with perceptions of safety. Although students report being safer at school today than in the 1990s, for example, significant numbers, 1 in 5 high school students, for example, say they don't feel safe. And their safety concerns range from school shootings to fears of being bullied. Significant minorities also question the fairness of school rules or believe they aren't consistently enforced. And a true community, of course, encourages or even demands participation if it's going to thrive. Participatory experiences, we find, are available to students in some areas of school life. Many, for example, participate in extracurricular activities. But students perceive fewer opportunities to participate in the classroom, for example, to freely express their opinions or hear diverse opinions of others, or with regard to school policy or governance. Next slide. A few other examples. I think although most youth report positive relations with peers, again, a concerning minority report they have no close friends or don't feel supported by their peers. And disturbingly, in some recent surveys, 20%, 1 in 5 high schoolers felt there was no adult at school who knew them well. In a survey that I conducted with colleagues, 2/3 said they weren't confident that their teachers would help stop bullying. And finally, although it perhaps isn't unusual or unexpected that a minority of students say they like school a lot, of greater concern is that nearly half say they don't feel part of their school community. The next slide, please. So I think data suggests that schools are places of community for some, but certainly not all students. So the question is, which students lack strong connections to school? I think we know that students are less likely to perceive schools as places of community if they're older, for example, if they come from communities of color, if they are sexual minority youth, if they've been bullied, and or if they experience personal economic challenges. Also, if their families feel less connected or involved in school. And also if they tend to attend larger schools, if they live in urban communities, if they have fewer models of culturally similar staff at their schools, or live in households or communities that are in poverty. Next slide. So how can schools promote a sense of community where it's lacking, or at least lacking among a minority of students? Interesting efforts to promote a sense of community in schools, I think, has initially focused on structural changes to a large extent, such as promoting smaller schools or block scheduling or departmental teaming, or maybe more recently looping, where teachers stay with students through several years. And I would argue that research suggests that structural changes may be helpful, but will likely have only a modest effect on students' sense of community in schools. What is likely to have more bang for the buck, and I can only give snapshots here because of our time, let me highlight a few. At the individual and classroom level, building caring relationships, warmth, support, responsiveness by teachers and other staff, I think, are critical, obviously, to creating a sense of community within the classroom, for example, particularly those who lack academic or other supports at home or the community. As another example, students' perceptions of school community, we find, are higher in schools where teachers focus some time on social and emotional learning and integrate this learning into academic learning. For example, in our bullying prevention efforts, we found that the use of class meeting time is not just helpful in reducing bullying or preventing bullying, but in building a sense of community. Next slide. And at the school-wide level, a few other snapshots. We know that efforts in the classroom really have to be complemented by changes at the broader school-wide level to enhance a sense of community. So key strategies, again, include warmth and engagement, not just by individual teachers, but by all members of the school community, family support and engagement, promoting peer safety and support and mental well-being. For example, support groups for sexual minority youth, among many, many other important examples. Avoiding harsh, inflexible disciplines, such as zero tolerance policies. Curricular and extracurricular activities that foster social support or belonging, like service learning, or encouraging contacts between students of different grades and abilities. And finally, professional development that really emphasizes the importance of building community and increasing the competence of staff and their skills in doing so. And last slide, please. And of course, interventions shouldn't be bound to the school walls, and schools are not the only domain in which students benefit from feeling part of a community. I think the key is, as overly noted, to engage youth in supportive relationships in multiple settings, where they live, where they play, where they work, and where they worship. And during COVID, I think this may be particularly challenging, but it's more important than ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue. And in many ways, you were a perfect introduction to the topic that I'm going to discuss, which is the racial and ethnic disparities in disciplinary outcomes. And I think a lot of this has to do with the types of contexts that young people are placed within, and the types of supports, as you mentioned, that are available to them within those contexts. If you could advance the slide. So what I'd like to do is to just talk generally about racial ethnic disparities and discuss some of the factors both within school and more contextual types of factors that impact those disparities. So what are the racial and ethnic disparities in disciplinary outcomes? For those of you who have not followed this literature, this is sadly an outcome that researchers have been tracking now for probably 30 years or more. And one of the things that we see in the disciplinary data is that Black children, Latinx children in general are overrepresented in the types of office disciplinary referrals and in the types of sanctions, particularly exclusionary types of sanctions, that is out of school suspension and expulsion. And one of the things that we see in this research is that this isn't a localized phenomena. I mean, it really, there have been several national studies that have found that on average in national samples that students of color are 2 to 3 times more likely to receive an office disciplinary referral, and similar inequities in the out of school suspensions. Now, one of the reasons why I think this is particularly important is because of all of the consequences that emanate from the receiving harsh discipline, and particularly exclusionary types of sanctions. One of the things that we know is that it has been implicated in kind of decreases in high school graduation, which also then radiates into longer term kind of health outcomes, both health and well-being outcomes for young people. One of the things that in some of the most recent research is that is implicated more directly in this process of pushing students from schools into the criminal justice system. And again, once that, I think one of the things that's pretty clear is that once that process starts, it's really difficult to kind of intervene in that process and to help young people back on tracks that will be generative. So I think one of the questions that I have been studying and dealing with here in the last few years is, why are we still talking about this? I mean, there has been quite a bit of effort on trying to reduce these, to identify the disparities and reduce them. And one of the things that we're finding in our work here in Nashville is that part of the difficulty is that there are multiple problems. And for the most part, the types of interventions that we have been developing so far capture pieces of it without ever having a full conceptualization of the types of things that are impacting it. So just want to go through just a brief review of some of the things that are associated with these inequities. In Nashville, what we found was that the rate of inequity was 3.2 to 1. So that is, students of color were a little more than 3 times more likely than white students to be to receive exclusionary sanctions. Now, one of the things when we started to unpack that, we found that there were, as I mentioned, multiple issues. I mean, one of them, and we've certainly seen intervention around explicit and implicit bias. That is, one of the things that we don't see very much is kind of openly discriminatory types of behavior among educators. Not saying that it doesn't happen, but we don't see that as much as really the subtle and often types of decisions that where educators are unaware of the types of differences they are making between students. And we certainly have seen some promising interventions around implicit bias training to try to address that. We also see things around disciplinary practices and policies. One of the things that has, I think, emerged as a really significant intervention is simply having more specific types of disciplinary codes. That is, in many districts, including Nashville's, the most common source of out of school suspensions are often things like disrespect, or in fact, one of our big codes was conduct prejudicial to good order. Now, that can mean a lot of things, and in fact did mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and therefore kind of mask the issues that were being dealt with through exclusionary sanctions. I think one of the other things I'll highlight here is what we also really begin to see, and this is, again, isn't unique to Nashville, is that the size of the problem really varies at the level that you look at the problem. So one of the things that we found was that the problem was really driven by two distinct issues. One was within school disparities. So we would have schools that were somewhat integrated, that would have relatively high inequities, in some cases as many as 17 to 1. The issue there, though, was that the population of students of color are relatively small in those schools, versus where we saw the big effects were the fact that our schools are still relatively segregated. And we had low suspending schools primarily serving white students, and relatively high suspending schools serving Black students. And I think those are the types of things, if you think about those as problems to be addressed, they really call for different types of interventions. You know, I think this flows naturally into some of the contextual issues that are also influencing it. You can advance. Thank you. So part of what we've also been endeavoring to do is to get a sense of some of those community contributors. One of the things that as I talk with school districts, one of the things that is almost universally true in most jurisdictions is that schools have the best data on the well-being of their young people. And those of us who work with schools know that there's all kinds of problems with school data, but even so, schools still have the best data as a population of young people. And as a result, one of the things that often happens is that the problems that are broader than schools often get captured in school data. And one of what we've been endeavoring to do is to look at these other data sources, and in some cases start to collect other data sources that start to to give us a better sense of the types of inequities that may be outside of the school that may be contributing to what's happening within the school. So in this particular case, I want to highlight three: the access to resources, exposures to trauma, and systematic marginalization events. So with access to resources, one of the things that we've endeavored to do is to do a survey of young people just to get a sense of what of their neighborhoods and the resources that they have access to. And as you can imagine, there are startling inequities there. One of the things that we see is that as students get older, they are, and often in this you know, with age, aggregating more risk, they are also less likely to have adults, good relationships with adults, particularly adults outside of their home or school. The other thing that comes through repeatedly in the data is that different parts of young people living in different parts of the city have fundamentally different experiences. They have less access to resources. They also have more difficulty getting around. And one of the things that I highlight there at the bottom is that this becomes particularly a problem because you have young people who are living and who report their neighborhoods are least safe and have the fewest assets. But they are also the ones who are less likely to be able to move and to have mobility that allows them to access things outside of their neighborhood. So it is the proverbial rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer in that case. Go ahead. You'll have trouble seeing this, but here I wanted to demonstrate just the differential exposure to adverse events. And in this particular case, it's just gun violence. And what you see here is just the layout of Nashville, and you can see the zip code areas that are represented here. And what immediately sticks out is that the gun violent events are really clustered in pretty tightly in a few communities. It's probably not surprising that those communities are also communities where kids are they're lower income, they're higher percentages of Black and Latinx students. And you know, one of the things that we're particularly interested in is that we know that trauma affects the student's ability to benefit in the context of a classroom. So part of what we're looking at are SEL interventions that are promoting mindfulness and other ways of acknowledging the trauma that young people are bringing into their school buildings. Next slide. The last thing that I'll highlight as a differential that hasn't been traditionally captured in school data, at least, is just the systemic marginalization. And I could spend the rest of our time really talking about this. One of the things that you know, the Brookings Institution did a study, just last year that highlighted the fact that 37208 in Nashville zip code had the highest incarceration rate among people born in the 1980s. Now, one of the significant things about that, not only is that just stunning for us who live in this community, but one of the other things about that is that for young people born in the 1980s, if they had children in their late teens to mid 20s, they are the students who are currently in our schools. So there's a good chance that the 37208 young people are being affected by these types of structural issues that are continuing to radiate, the effects of which are continuing to radiate. The last thing I'll just say is that we've also done focus groups and police surveillance and a variety of different ways in which you know, the structure and the experience of the city. Young people really, as I share with people, young people aren't stupid. I mean, they see how they are treated differently from young people in other parts of the city. And this comes in the form of surveillance. It comes in the form of gentrification and being pushed out of spaces that they were formerly able to utilize. And I would just close by saying these are the types of things that I think aren't captured in the school data, but are present in the school data. And I think is one of our challenges is to figure out not only how to better to capture these things, but also to think more broadly about the types of interventions that may radiate well beyond the school building. And lastly, I just want to acknowledge colleagues, both university colleagues, community colleagues, and young people who have given their time and effort.
I think that these presentations really bleed nicely together here. I'm going to talk today about thinking about equity, and in particular, I really value the presentation that just went talking about what are inequity structures within the school. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some policies that have probably continued to perpetuate these particular inequities that we're seeing at more of a state level as well. Do the next slide. Thanks. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of school choice and how that has had an impact on resources within schools and how it continues to kind of further perpetuate these inequities. And I come with this with a framework from an ecological systems theory framework, thinking about that as we do work in partnership with schools and communities, that there are larger systemic policies, structures, and funding structures at national and federal levels that still have an impact on the resources that are coming into these schools. And so today I want to highlight what particular policies maybe to keep out a mind for and think about ways to advocate for, as well as what impact that has on young people and their health and well-being. And they're very aware of these policies too. So next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk about school choice and its relationship right now with COVID-19. So I know the term choice sounds very appealing here. So school choice is allowing a school district to accept students from other school districts, and the resources that come with that particular student goes to that school that they have selected to be in. So school choice has been a policy that has been enacted state by state, but there's a big push to get this at the federal level as well by Secretary Betsy DeVos. And the recent acts have been around School Choice Act now, which is $5 billion to fund a tax credit program that will benefit companies and individuals who contribute scholarships so families can use tax dollars for private schools. So incentives, again, for these students to be leaving certain schools and being able to access other schools. And typically the schools they're accessing have more resources, and the schools that they're leaving have less resources, and them leaving those schools also hinders those resources. There have been efforts, although stalled, but something to keep an eye out for with regards to COVID-19. There was movement to try to utilize $180 million of federal leave to create kind of a competition for states to rethink education. And here, they were trying to do continued learning parent microgrants, which would give monies to families so they could access high quality remote learning options that could be used for public or private school providers here. And this actually did get slowed down and stalled, but it's just something to keep on the radar here. That these are policies that I'm going to highlight in this presentation briefly that already have an impact on the health and well-being and the school climate, and might continue to if there are continued efforts to kind of try to get this into our school systems. So Secretary Betsy DeVos was really pushing for school choice in the state of Michigan, and that's actually where this study was conducted. And would you mind going back just one more? Thank you. And in urban school districts in particular, what my case study found, as well as some other scholars, was that urban school districts in particular experienced, once school choice was enacted, lower capital expenditures, deterioration in the school buildings, a decline in student enrollment, and a shift in demographics. So really what we saw was that students, the term choice is so misleading because students and families that didn't have the opportunity, the resources to go to these other schools were in school districts that were losing resources as these families were continuing to have their children go there and didn't have those options. So we saw a lot of resources leaving these urban school districts and seeing that they're going into wealthier school districts. And so we begin to see a larger deterioration in school resources, as well as in those community spaces right near those schools, so that this policy began to kind of further distinguish between resources and accesses of wealth as well. And in the next slide, I wanted to highlight here that just in 1 year, we actually saw a big difference here in a case study that I was doing. In particular, that urban school district A, which is the site of this study, we saw a drop in student enrollment, less expenditures per student, and proficiency scores rating much lower than we see in some of the wealthier suburban school districts in which students were moving to and families were as well. And this is only during a 1 year time frame, right? So this is something that's been implemented now for over a decade. So we are continuing to kind of see these inequities occurring, but each year actually, it's still very drastic. You can see kind of these structures are being talked about in the presentations before that were further exacerbated by a policy like this. And so just thinking about the impact of these types of macro level policies on some of the work we're doing in schools, still continuing to take resources away from these schools. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So this particular project I did that I'm going to talk very briefly about was doing a participatory action research ethnographic study within one school to kind of really understand what are students' schooling experiences. So from students' perspectives as co-researchers, what did they see, what was impacting their school? And really trying to see if they brought up these narratives around school choice, budget cuts, resource deprivation. And so this project was in partnership with 6th and 7th grade middle school students. So I really took to heart what Dr. Maury Nation was talking about in the slides before. Students know what is going on. And they feel these messages that are being shared. Policies have an implication, it has an implications on their health and well-being and their right to school. And so they're aware of that, they know that, and they feel that impact. So here we were having discussion where I asked them, so what do you mean what's making the school poor? The students said the government, they're wasting their money on stuff we need. They're whack, they're cheap, somebody got $1 million in the government, but they don't use it for our school. So they were very aware that resources were going into other schools and that those resources were not necessarily occurring within their schools. And I think even within a 1 year time frame of the participatory project, we're asking what did they notice from year to year? They were noticing those resources being moved out. And so it really kind of highlights the impact within one state where school choice was occurring there, and just kind of highlighting, I think also what was in the first presentation, that schools can be community spaces, but when those resources are moved out, they don't feel like community spaces because people are stretched thin with those resources. If you wouldn't mind, next slide here. So really thinking about what are the different ways that we can be aware of and think through the implications for this type of work, and what types of things does school choice have. This is something that I think is going to be continuing to come up in the agenda. Right now is there has been a push to kind of move school choice forward, and there's been several attempts to do that. And so I think keeping an eye out for that is really important. We already know that there have been resources impacted by COVID-19 in schools already, and there are inequities in school learning that is occurring right now that I'm sure we could all talk about in much greater length. But I think it's really important as we think about equity, also thinking about, well, what are policies that are continuing to push inequity as we're doing these partnerships with schools, as we're thinking about community wraparound services, what policies can we keep our eye out for as advocates here, and really make sure we're kind of naming what they are. So with regards to policy implications, something to think about is to educate policy makers and the general public on the impact of school choice in regards to equity, community well-being, and student health. So really thinking about challenging the narratives and notions when we hear about school choice. It's very usually showcases a family that's super happy with these implications of the policy, and we don't necessarily think about, well, what are all the resources that are being left? Does that family get the support when they go to those new schools? There's lots of implications there. And so really helping people, the general public, deconstruct that, and also think about ways to raise awareness around this, that this is a policy that could have implications even further when we think about resource distribution, can be really valid here. So I think another thing, a poll, is to also stay alert and attentive to the allocation and use of federal aid to promote a school choice agenda. And it might not necessarily come in the terms of a school choice, but these microloan programs, these parent support programs, these are kind of the language that's being used to really promote this agenda, where it has what we found in the state of Michigan, and several authors, as I noted in the slide, have really found that these resources have moved away from these school spaces. And so we're just really thinking through what implications that could further have if that was kind of put on a national level. We know state by state that this has an area there as well. So I just wanted to highlight that as we're thinking about equity and we're thinking about community, that these policies, these macro system policies, play a role in here too. And really thinking about when we're doing intervention-based work or data-based collection, can we capture some of these implications too in these efforts? Can we capture this type of information in our collaboration as well? Because they have this input on the work we're trying to do of making schools safe, thriving spaces for young people, and really thinking about that from an equity lens. So I think next slide. So yeah, so that paper itself is up and available, and my contact information is there. And I just wanted to thank the school that I partnered with and the amazing student researchers that worked with me on that project as well. I'm very grateful for their partnership.
So following Sue, Maury, and Mariah's discussions about what's happening in schools and at the policy level right now, I'll be talking about the importance of having leaders both in the school and community who explicitly address racial equity in making policy and program decisions. And I'll also give an example of a tool that schools can use to help make these decisions. So as others have highlighted, there are racial and ethnic disparities in school-related outcomes, such as academic achievement, discipline infractions, and exclusionary sanctions, where students of color are being excluded from schools at much higher rates than white students, as well as in perceptions of school community and school climate, where again, students of color have much more negative perceptions of school climate than white students do. And unfortunately, these disparities often persist despite school-wide program and policy interventions. So for example, in interventions to improve social, emotional, and academic outcomes, although suspensions school-wide decrease, disparities in suspensions by race persist. Similarly, in school-level policy changes to discipline procedures, unless they're explicitly done with a racial equity lens, although discipline infractions may decrease school-wide, Black male students specifically continue to be suspended at higher rates than white male students. Similarly, when schools implement school security measures such as police officers or security cameras, although disparities in suspensions by race actually increase, and disparities in perceptions of school climate often persist. So as school leaders continue to try and improve school-related outcomes, it's critical that these leaders consider the potentially inequitable impact of these programs and policies. The racial equity impact assessment is one tool that can help school leaders do that. This is a tool that can be used to examine how different racial and ethnic groups will be affected by policies or programs, with the goal to minimize unanticipated adverse consequences and ultimately to prevent continued institutional racism. Thanks, Ryan. The racial equity impact assessment has been used in other settings, such as in governmental settings when a local government was looking at which neighborhoods to invest in for transit and pedestrian mobility options, as well as looking at policies to address unemployment disparities. The racial equity impact assessment has also been used in healthcare settings. For example, one healthcare setting used it to look at the potential impact of a policy to reduce exposure to environmental toxins, and another setting used it to look at how to increase access to midwife or doula care, specifically for women of color. The racial equity impact assessment has also been used by the Minneapolis School District. First, it was used in 2008 when the district was trying to respond to low student enrollment and was deciding what types of policies to implement. And the school district has continued to use this assessment tool for the past 10+ years now. And so there are 6 different steps in implementing this tool. Often in a school district, a team of school district leaders would work together in implementing this tool and quickly start working and collaborating with local stakeholders and other community leaders. So after identifying a policy or program proposal that is under consideration, I'll use the example of implementing school resource officers in schools. This team would involve stakeholders and look for stakeholders' perspectives on this program or policy, as well as analyze existing data. So in this example, you may include students, parents, and teachers, as well as other school staff like school nurses or school social workers. You also could include district leaders and police officers in this collaborative stakeholder process. In speaking with the stakeholders who are most impacted, you're wanting to understand what the possible benefits of this program or policy are, as well as the potential burdens. So although some district leaders, for example, may think that putting school resource officers in schools will increase the safety of those schools, in using data and talking to students, you will find, and the research suggests, that putting police officers in schools increases suspension rates, especially for students of color. Using these benefits and burdens that you've discussed, you can then identify strategies to advance opportunity or minimize harm. Often going through these first 4 steps may result in you adapting the original policy or program, or returning to the drawing board and coming up with a new policy or program that's more suitable and appropriate for the local context. When you do decide on a policy or program to implement, you should make sure you have a plan for evaluation, as well as to understand how the impact of this program or policy varies by groups based on their race or ethnicity. And as always, you should make sure to report your findings back to the community and local stakeholders so that you can continue to build trusting relationships and engage in this collaborative process moving forward. So as I've described, this assessment tool can be used to inform decision-making processes at the school district level, but it also can be used in partnership with local government. And some of the previous speakers have spoken about how important it is for schools to work with their communities because children are impacted by both the school and community context. For example, in Charlotte, the city of Charlotte is currently working with Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools to provide access to internet and Wi-Fi to low-income communities so that those students can continue to attend school during COVID. This tool can also be used at the state or federal level, for example, in assessing the policies that Mariah was talking about to understand the potential impacts that those policies would have on different communities. And so just in closing, I think given the ongoing disparities in school-related outcomes between students of color and white students, school districts must implement programs and policies with explicit consideration of how these decisions may contribute to or uphold existing disparities. The racial equity impact assessment, those simple 6 steps that I just described, is one tool that school districts can use to do this. And I can be reached via my email, rsiegal@uncc.edu.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, what's clear when we look at our various presentations today, and there's a real convergence of themes, that we see substantial issues of inequity in power, resource, opportunity, the effects or impact of practices and policy. We see variability in our educational infrastructure and resources. We see disparities in educational opportunities within the same district, within the same community. And we clearly have, as Maury was pointing out, decades of data regarding disproportionate disciplinary practices for the same transgressions and meaningful differences in achievement. One of the important themes across our speakers and for this work in general, we can't limit our interventions to what occurs within the walls of the school. Doing so will immediately limit the reach and impact that we may be able to have. We really need an ecologically grounded perspective. We need to take a broader accounting for and attend to those different factors and influences that may be at play. And in doing so, right, there's a clear need for multi-level analysis and multi-level action. We need to make sure, right, these problems are comprehensive in nature. Our responses need to be comprehensive in nature and sustained. These are not the kinds of issues that we're going to be able to address with a 10-week intervention program or one special class with a curriculum implemented. We need to really take a longer haul view, and the nature of our actions really need to focus not only about what we can do locally and at this more with our local schools and what action can take place at that level, but up to the policy level, thinking more macro. We highlighted a set of priorities today, but it's clear that the needs are pronounced, that there are gaps in what we covered today. And this is not possibly an exhaustive list, but just highlighting the kinds of things on which this task force could and will function going forward, or focus, going forward. School mental health and well-being, suicide prevention. Rachel made multiple mentions of school security measures, right? The impact of school resource officers, metal detectors. How can we use data to better inform what we're doing in our schools? School shooter drills and their implications. Bullying, school violence prevention. Frankly, one of the things that we hear from some of our local school partners all the more is the degree to which trauma is really affecting what's happening in the classroom, particularly within some of our communities that have been traditionally marginalized and socioeconomically disadvantaged. We need to consider how to bring those kind of strategies to scale. The need to better integrate social emotional learning approaches in our schools from pre-K on up. Now, again, not a 10-week program, and to not just have them in communities where you have folks who are really concentrating and focusing their professional lives on doing this kind of work. How can we get higher levels of uptake? How do we do a better job being sensitive and responsive to youth who are transgendered or other sexual minorities? And we could go on. The needs are many. And so, while on the one hand, that may not seem like a very hopeful note to underscore, the way we really see it is those needs also can be framed as challenges for action, challenges to do something and to make a contribution. So where do we go from here? Well, one clear priority for us as a task force is to grow our group, to grow the diversity of perspectives represented. The kinds of issues that we're talking about don't fall under the purview of any one discipline or any one school of thought. And we're going to be better served when we have folks representing, again, different disciplines and different settings in which you're functioning. One possibility that we've seen in the Alliance's other task forces is the development of subgroups built around different areas of focus. So we would still have our broader umbrella Safe and Humane Schools group, but we could have working groups focusing on different topic areas. Products and actions, well, we could consider journal submissions, whether articles, special sections, and the like. policy resolutions and statements will certainly be important. But I'm comfortable in speaking for the group on this front and saying we're not involved with this. We're too committed, and frankly, we're too busy to just focus on white papers and the like. That we're concerned with action. How do we affect changes in practice and policies and systems? So where we welcome inputs and insights and guidance are around strategies or mechanisms for disseminating products to school research groups, to policy audiences. How can we better connect with and work in partnership with national education advocacy groups? How can we work for change within our local districts and beyond? So the needs are plenty. The opportunities certainly are. And we're a group that's committed to taking these challenges on head on. So if you're interested in getting involved, first off, membership is required in terms of being on a task force member or on one of these task forces. But you can contact us and contact the central office at the email listed there, office@bhjustice.org, to let us know you're interested. So on behalf of the group, first off, again, thank you for your interest in our children, our youth, and our schools. And again, the way to get involved, in email at office@bhjustice.org. We look forward to hearing from you.